Governor Rauner tries to block Syrian refugees from Illinois, and the state budget is still in limbo. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. With me today, Hannah Meisel is here, WILL radio reporter from Urbana. Thanks for coming over, Hannah.
Glad to be here.
Charlie Wheeler is back. He is director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, University of Illinois Springfield. Previous to that, a longtime Sun-Times reporter at the State House and from a family of Sun-Times reporters. Charlie, welcome.
Thanks, Bernie.
Okay. Well, obviously horrible news that came out of Paris in the last several days. 129 people, I believe, it was the death toll at one point. It could be higher. Terrorist attacks, links to Syria, and Governor Bruce Rauner was one of the first governors in America of what became about 30, mostly Republican, to say, we don't want to, at this point, take Syrian refugees into Illinois. Thoughts and response?
It was interesting that Governor Rauner was among the first. I think he was the 8th by my count on, I think it was Monday. And, like you said, it became about 27 governors, mostly Republican, a couple, I believe, Democrats, who said, we are going to at least temporarily halt accepting Syrian refugees across our borders. Earlier this fall, when the Syrian refugee crisis really came to light, President Obama said that the U.S. would accept 10,000 Syrian refugees this year. And so with 30 or 27 or so states, at least for now, fighting that, it's unclear where they would go. I saw one story that there was a family from Syria heading to Indianapolis, and they were blocked at the airport. Chicago, a couple days later, after Governor Rauner, became one of the many, Chicago passed a resolution that the city would be a safe haven for...
Right, the Chicago City Council.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. With Alderman Ed Burke, right?
Was leading the charge for that resolution. Well, it's interesting because the family that was turned away in Indiana was welcomed in Connecticut by the Connecticut governor, who personally greeted them and welcomed them to Connecticut and said, you're welcome to stay here. I think it's sad. I think it's unfortunate. I also think it's sort of irrational. If you look at it, and this is data from one of the agencies that's involved in settling refugees, we've had roughly 800,000 refugees since 2001 have come to the United States. Three have been detained for questioning for possible affiliations with some terrorist group. No convictions so far. You look back at the atrocities that we've seen, the school shooting, the theater shooting, the community college shooting. These were all done by people who were U.S. citizens who were mentally ill. And so I think there's a bigger danger there. And if I'm somebody plotting to commit some atrocity against America, I'm not going to pick up on Hannah and say, Hannah, you're going to be a refugee, you're going to pose as a refugee fleeing the terror in Syria, and you'll have to sit there and wait 18 months to 2 years, be out in a camp under primitive conditions, and then maybe, just maybe, the U.S. government will let you in. I'm going to say, well, Bernie, you're a French citizen, and so you get sign up for a tour to go visit the Grand Canyon or whatever, and you go to America and then go with our native jihadists and plot some terrorist attack. And so saying we're going to block these unfortunate souls who are basically fleeing the kind of conditions that we don't want to see here, to me it goes against what America is supposed to be about.
Well, and we've seen really, there's somewhat of a partisan divide, but also I think a geographic divide. I mean, Senator Dick Durbin, in a conference call that I was listening in on several weeks ago, said that America just should take 100,000 refugees from Syria. This is when we were seeing pictures of actually hundreds of thousands or millions of people streaming across Europe, walking to get places. So, Durbin, Hillary Clinton, Tammy Duckworth, who's running for U.S. Senate, are all saying things like, you know, what you just said, Charlie, this is America, whereas Republicans, many of them, including our governor, but Rodney Davis, who represents Congress, his district includes part of Springfield, you know, took a vote in Congress against allowing refugees in right now, that kind of thing. So there seems to be that divide. I also noticed that the news out of Chicago is a much more diverse community than like downstate and what you get in Springfield. So you listen to talk radio, for example, in Springfield, and almost all the callers are saying, hey, go get him, Governor, this is great. It seems to be a popular thing. Where in Chicago, you're getting more the human rights type folks saying, well, what about the refugees? What about refugees like, well, my mother actually came over as a refugee from Europe in the war, World War II in 1942, only because she had an uncle that sent money so they could get on a boat and not go back to another camp and, you know, never survive. So,
like Charlie had mentioned, this process to become, you know, kind of a U.S. A refugee accepted into the U.S. takes upwards to 2 years. You have to be interviewed at least once by the immigration enforcement people, and you also usually have an interview or two with the UN. It's not a short period of time. And we also have to mention that it's not even clear if it's legal for U.S. governors to block refugees from their borders, because immigration is a federal issue. So the State Department has been back and forth all week. Their lawyers are still trying to come up with a very definitive answer, but at this point it doesn't look like it's legal. It kind of looks like you know, governors are trying to say, hey, we are doing something by blocking, but...
Yeah, of course, state programs would probably affect these people, right, Charlie? So a governor could say
the federal government works through states, works through nonprofit organizations to help people adjust to a new life in America. Some of it is kind of the sustenance stuff, providing housing, providing money to buy food, clothing for the kids. Some of it is getting adjusted to American society, transition. For example, helping people learn English, helping them find job opportunities. This is all paid by largely, almost exclusively by the federal government through programs that sends the money out to the states. The states then, in most cases, hire nonprofit organizations to actually deliver the services. So I suppose what a governor could do is make it very difficult for the money to flow from the state to the agencies. If he wanted to, I guess, he could put up a big sign saying, foreigners go home. Yeah,
well, Governor Rauner has interestingly taken some actions in the past and then reversed them over time when there's enough public pressure. So I'm not sure if this is one of those cases. I think in the second day he put out something about, well, we just have to make sure things are okay. It was a little less stringent or strident than the first day's announcement after there was some negative reaction, particularly in Chicago. So we'll see if, you know, the kind of pro-humanitarian forces get to the governor.
Xenophobic folks are saying, we want the administration to assure us 100% that there's no chance that any terrorists will sneak in. And I'm thinking to myself, nothing is 100%. Yeah. We'll finish with this show today. I'll get in my van. I'll drive back to the university. I'm not 100% sure that I won't get hit by some drunk driver, you know?
Understood. Well, and your former newspaper, the Sun-Times, recently did a story, and I know we were talking about this before we started the show, has done some research about people with mental problems or flagged in a certain way with mental problems who still have guns because they have firearm owners' ID cards. So I know you were kind of comparing these two things.
Yeah, the Sun-Times did an investigation. It came out, and under the law, if you have a record of mental illness, you're not supposed to be able to get a firearm owner's identification card in the first place. And if you have, upon the notification that you've had this problem, your firearm, your FOIA card is revoked. And the Illinois State Police are supposed to, under the law, they're supposed to get any firearms you own and retrieve them. And what the Sun-Times found out is that there have been more than 50,000 people who've had their FOIA cards rejected because of mental problems. FOIA.
Right.
Yeah.
Firearm owner's ID card, right.
Yeah. I think that's what I said.
A FOIA, yeah. FOIA.
Not a
FOIA, anyway.
Firearm owner's identification
card,
yeah. Right. And that's the card that allows you to legally possess a weapon. And the Sun-Times did this analysis, and it turns out that we've not followed up on going and checking, okay, Wheeler, you got a mental problem. You have to turn in your FOIA card, and any weapons that you have, you're supposed to turn them over to us. So I say, nuts to you. I'm keeping my arsenal at home. Nobody follows up. And the Sun-Times reported, and make sure I get the numbers right, I actually brought it along here. In 2014, 14 weapons were seized from people with revoked FOIA identification cards, with revoked documentation. Only 14 out of 50,000. Yeah.
So you're saying maybe if we want to limit threats, maybe we should pay more. The state should pay more attention to that.
If the governor were really that concerned about what I consider to be the minuscule chance that one of these Syrian refugees is a sleeper agent. Half of them, by the way, are children. Only something like 2% of them are combat-age males. If he's really worried about that threat to violence, why doesn't he tell the state police, go out and check on these people who have mental illnesses? They're not supposed to have firearms, but they might. Because as I said before, the incidents that we have had have by and large been because of people who are mentally unstable. And if you think about violence, on any given weekend, there are more people killed in Chicago in gang violence than have been killed in Syrian-based terrorist attacks in this country ever.
Interesting. Well, we finally did it. We don't often talk about federal issues. When I say at the beginning of the show, we will, and this was one of those federal and state issues.
Okay.
Getting back to a very often kind of a thing we talk about on the show, the state budget. There still isn't one. The new fiscal year began, as we all know, July 1. So we're in the 5th month without a budget. About 90% of the budget is being paid, but we're getting more and more in debt all the time because the tax rate for income tax went down, I guess last January, and so less money is coming in, but we're still spending a lot of money. And yet some agencies aren't getting funded because they're not part of the court orders that are keeping funding going, or the one bill the governor did sign, which is in education. So there was going to be a meeting of all the 4 leaders of the legislative caucuses and the governor. It was going to be, I guess, this week.
Wednesday.
But then, because Speaker Madigan had a death in the family, said he was going to be at a funeral out of state, offered to send a state representative in his place. But Governor Rauner said, no, let's just postpone the meeting until December 1st. We assume it'll probably be in Springfield. Will anything happen there?
Well, late last week, I think on Friday night, the governor had released a format to the meeting, and it's supposed to be an hour of open, so it's going to be streamed and open to media, and there it's going to be the five of them give 10 minutes each on whatever they want to talk about. He, funnily enough, I found it funny at least. In his email, he sent suggestions for each person to talk about. So for Madigan, it would be balancing the budget and additional taxes. Leader Durkin, the need for reform before revenue. President Cullerton, overall spending levels, pension reform, Chicago's financial crisis. And Leader Rodonio, economic reforms, jobs, climate, what have you. And the governor said he would focus on term limits, redistricting, and local control of costs and property taxes. It's just interesting to me that obviously those are probably what they were going to talk about anyway, but it's interesting that he said, well, you should go for this.
And of course, since this happened, some of the reform groups that have called for the meeting sent another letter and said, please don't set the agenda, just start talking and keep it all public, because the governor wanted to go private after the opening statement.
Yeah, he wanted to make an hours of campaign speeches, and in essence he says to Madigan, will you explain why you want to raise taxes, and I'll explain why I want to improve the economy.
And do term limits, which will take effect like in 12 years or so, which of course he says is one of the things that would make Illinois better in the long run.
And I guess that's really the long run. And as I've said on other occasions, if you're trying to get rid of Madigan and you have this term limit amendment, and the proposal that's been offered by his legislative leaders in both chambers says after people are sworn in 2017, they can only serve 10 more years. Doesn't matter how many they served before. So by my calculations, it would impact Madigan when he's a few months shy of his 85th birthday.
Understood. Yeah, well, it's not going to you know, even Governor Rauner, before he released his agenda, had said in some public events, well, if this is public, you know, that's not the way you get it. He was like scoffing, that's not how you get stuff done when you really want to get stuff done. So then he, you know, talked about having the meeting private. Now we'll have to see if he switches the agenda or the plan based on what the do-gooder groups have asked, you know, as far as an open meeting without these speeches at the beginning. But I'm assuming there will be something like that. How is collateral damage going? You know, we know that the Illinois State Museum, for example, in Springfield is still closed. We know, I saw Comptroller Leslie Munger speaking to a Republican group in Springfield this week. She was talking about, you know, she's talking, we really need to make structural change in Illinois, as the governor does, but she also said, you know, in the meantime, we're shredding some of the social service safety net. Because we know that things like daycare centers that haven't been paid in months, some of them have had to lay off people or close. We know that the senior center in Springfield no longer delivers meals on Fridays, for example, and they may have to cut back further. And we know that universities and colleges, some of them, especially the ones without the big endowments, are talking about maybe not accepting, you know, the promise of certain state grants, MAP grants, for the next semester because they still haven't been paid for what they've been owed for students this semester. So how bad is this, and do we have any projection yet as to when we might see a resolution of this budget situation?
Well, I've been saying all along that basically two things have to happen. One is we have to get by the filing period. Candidates who want to run for General Assembly seats in 2016 have to file their petitions by the end of this month.
Yeah, it starts Monday and goes through the next Monday. So we will, I guess it ends the 30th, so by then we'll know who's getting primary.
So December 1st we'll know who has a primary contest. Because of the way the districts are structured, because of the gerrymander, either the reprehensible or the genius gerrymander the Democrats did, most lawmakers are in safe districts in terms of partisan-wise. So if I'm most Republican lawmakers, I only have to worry about a primary challenge. If I'm most Democratic lawmakers, I only have to worry about a primary challenge. I will know on December 1st whether or not I'm going to have a primary challenge. And so if I don't have a primary challenge, that means I may be able to do the hard things, but the responsible things that would open me up to somebody sniping at me from the right in a Republican primary, from the left in a Democratic primary. And so once that's gone, we'll see what the field looks like for March. Then if you get past the first of the year, you can do all this stuff with fewer votes. If you try to do it before the end of the year, it requires an extraordinary majority under the Constitution for the bill to become effective immediately.
Right.
And if it's not effective immediately, it doesn't do any good. After the first of the year, you can do it with a simple majority. That's 6 fewer votes in the Senate, 11 fewer votes in the House. And because this will be a bipartisan agreement and the governor will be signing it, they'll divvy it up between Republicans and Democrats. It might be in the Senate, there might be 18 Democrats, 12 Republicans. In the House, it might be, I don't know, out of the 60, it could be 35 Democrats, 25 Republicans, something like that. And it'll happen the way this stuff has always happened in the past. The only difference is we'll be doing it 6 months later than what you and I are used to seeing. And unfortunately for Hannah, you've not been able to report on when the legislative leaders and the governor actually did negotiate these things, split their difference, work out a deal, and let the state move forward.
It's interesting. We were mentioning before Governor Rauner's aversion to negotiating things in public. So earlier this fall, a working group that had started out as just female legislators and then male legislators joined. They had worked out a pretty substantial agreement, and I have it. It was previously confidential. It was made public this week, so I have it right here. It looks pretty all-encompassing to me. It included things like taxing retirement income over $50,000, workers' compensation reform, property tax freeze, both of which the governor has said those are things that he absolutely needs before agreeing.
Workers' comp and the property tax.
And other things like setting a spending level for this year that we are now almost halfway through.
But of course, but all of this just kind of falls by the wayside.
It does because one, things started to leak. The governor hates leaks, and
or at least seems to.
Right, and this was run up the
He
flag.
doesn't explain all of his views to us in the 10 minutes we get once in a while.
We're gonna get in trouble for that. But you know, it was run up the flagpole by the Republicans in this working group, and he said no, there's not enough reforms in it, and it was shut down. And so, again, the things, any steps that we have made toward a compromise have been shut down. So we don't appear any closer than we were, even though it seems, you know, last week we had some votes in the legislature that seem to be steps forward on compromise.
Well, the governor did back off some of the cuts he had made in the past about child care and elder care, and so.
So in the public, yeah, he's definitely winning there. But then among the ranks, especially Democrats, you know, they can just say all he did was back off of the problem that he created months ago, which was, you know, using emergency rules to cut.
I would be willing to bet, though, that these are the items that will be the framework for whatever the final settlement is. You know,
because somebody's done good work.
Yeah,
it looks like.
And with all due respect to Ken Duncan, who is pictured himself as the, you know, he's the man.
The one Democrat who didn't vote with the Democrats to override the governor on some things.
I think, you know, he can brag all he wants, but the reality of the situation, in my judgment, is that moderate Republicans around the state, downstate and elsewhere, said to the governor, we've had your back in the General Assembly. We've taken all these votes that are bad for our constituents because you want us to, and because you got $1 billion that you can use against us. But on these issues, on the child care and on the determination of need for whether seniors get in-home services as opposed to going to a nursing home, Governor, with due respect, we're going to have to break with you. We're going to have to support this legislation because it's vital to our constituents. And the governor, to his credit, growing in the job, said, okay, I understand, I'll back off on this stuff, but don't vote for the override to take away my power and the power of future governors to make these changes if they deem it necessary. So that's what's happened. So Duncan can stand up and grandstand and say, yeah, I broke my word to the unions.
But I'm doing it for the right purpose and for the governor.
And in reality, it was, I think it was the quiet conversations between moderate, sensible Republican lawmakers and the governor and his staff that got them to reconsider.
Now, but again, this is conjecture, right? Because they're not, the governor and his staff aren't exactly sharing these with things.
Oh, no, that's okay. I look at it, I don't care how we get to the result. I don't care who takes credit for it. I just want to see it happen.
Right. Speaking of unions, the governor put out, his administration, a press release this week saying that they had come to collective bargaining agreements with several unions, and there were bold-faced letters, why doesn't AFSCME, the biggest union that represents 35,000 state workers, take this kind of deal? Look at all these other unions, which are mostly trade unions, you know, agreeing with the state on various things, including health care, and we'll give them a certain amount per month. What's interesting is, as Doug Finke of our staff at the SJR wrote the story, all those agreements, the new ones this week, were like 500 workers. The governor and his negotiators have come to agreements with unions representing about 5,000 in all since he's taken office. So we're still waiting for like the 35,000 state workers and the more than 50,000 like healthcare workers that get paid through the state and are unionized as well through SEIU, Service Employees International Union. So those unions, AFSCME and SEIU, are like attacking the governor for making these, you know, tough statements and not negotiating nicely, where the governor is saying to them, look, these other unions are coming in line. So is anybody right here?
Well, I think one big difference is the fact that most of those other unions have health care plans, some by the union, some through other means, where they don't have to rely on the state for health care. Whereas SEIU people, AFSCME people, myself and Hannah, we have to rely on the state for health care. And so the kind of cuts that the governor is proposing that the other unions agreed to in health care if you're in a trade union and your international, has its own health care program, you can say to the governor, oh yeah, not a problem.
Because I get my insurance
yeah,
over here.
because I'm covered over here.
Yeah, but if you're one
that's
of those
not true
state,
for
if you're
yeah,
the
so
35,000 state workers, you have to take that plan.
Yeah,
and
that's
complaining
one
that they might.
Big difference.
I think it's a 4-year pay freeze that the governor's side wants, and some of them say that health care costs for them might double or something, but I'm not sure of that. But
right.
Well, it depends on the individual.
Sure, and for family and everything else. We have, as I mentioned earlier, Monday is the beginning of filing for the next round of elections. Believe it, there's always another election. And it is interesting, I've never been through this. I've been doing it, Charlie, you've been doing it longer than me, but I've been doing it about 30 years, and I've never watched candidates file before a state budget is in place. So we've got that starting at the State Board of Elections Monday, and it's judges and legislators and members of Congress and Senate. I will mention that a state senator from the Chicago area, Napoleon Harris, former NFL player, has jumped in on the Democratic side for U.S. Senate versus Tammy Duckworth, who has most of the party support, but Andrea Zopp, who's a former head of the Chicago Urban League, and I think Harvard Law, and a very good resume too. So interesting race on the Democratic side. And Republican side, everybody does say Mark Kirk, but at this Republican meeting I attended this week, a guy named James Martyr of Oswego, businessman, hasn't quite raised $20,000 yet, but he's taking on Mark Kirk and says that he will be filing, that he's already got more than the 5,000 signatures needed and is having more. So we will be looking forward. Any surprises? Well, there's always surprises when people file.
Well, sure. I mean, I think we should be looking closely at the vulnerable suburban and downstate Democrats that Rauner has been eyeing with his big campaign coffers since basically before he came into office, looking forward to 2016. Anyone like that, there might be some there are always surprises on the congressional race level, interesting people there.
Yeah, well, we will see. And one other thing, like in the Springfield region, we've had so many new people, but Raymond Poe was a 20-year legislator in Springfield, just was named by the governor to be Director of Agriculture. As we do this show before it airs, we don't exactly know who's going to be his replacement, but there will be a guy named Tony Del Giorno is a Democrat who has announced in what's considered a pretty Republican district, so it might be difficult for him to win. And then the Republicans are deciding among, I think, 11 people applied, and the governor's people, oddly, and we don't know if this is going to play out, sent a message, I guess, a quote to me, the governor is watching this carefully and will be endorsing, which was odd for someone who also talks about local control in other things, but he wanted perhaps to have an effect. So we'll see where that
and the
goes.
way it works is because Representative Poe's legislative district is entirely within Sangamon County. Right. It's only the Sangamon County Republican officials who will say who the replacement is. And they will
make that decision, and by the time you watch this, we might know. Anyway, Hannah Meisel, thank you very much. Charlie Wheeler, thanks again. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.